Alrighty, good evening everyone. Welcome to our celebration of Heritage Week, where we recognize the enduring legacy of our patron, St. Francis de Sales. This evening we focus on the realm of law and society, recalling that St. Francis de Sales was himself educated in civil and church law, and he spent a great deal of his life as a bishop on diplomatic missions, both for the church and the government of France. Our speaker this evening is a lawyer and a diplomat of another sort. He comes to us this evening from Princeton University, where he is the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and founding director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions. He also serves as the Vaughan Senior Fellow of the Witherspoon Institute. He studied at Swarthmore College and earned doctoral degrees from Harvard University and from the University of Oxford. With that education, he has, over the course of 30 years, honed his thinking to become the leading American exponent of a contemporary natural law ethic in the realms of philosophy, constitutional law, and political theory. He has written extensively on civil rights, bioethics, marriage, and other cultural questions. He has lectured at Harvard, Yale, Cornell, and St. Andrews in Scotland, and he can now add DeSales University to that list. But if I were to name all of his scholarly works, professional affiliations, and honorary awards, we would have absolutely no time for his presentation. So, that presentation tonight focuses on his current work as chairman of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. That freedom remains fundamental to our personal and social lives, for, in his words, it is the right of people everywhere to heed the call of conscience in matters of religion and belief, living out its dictates openly, peacefully, and without fear. Nevertheless, as we know that freedom is under constant threat, both here and abroad, and this sad reality demands our vigilant attention. As he wrote just 2 weeks ago on Religious Freedom Day, standing for the persecuted is not just a moral imperative. It is a practical necessity for any country seeking to enhance stability and protect its security and that of its citizens. Our speaker has himself stood for the persecuted and for all of us who are citizens in a free land. His witness to what is true and good and beautiful about human life is principled and unflagging. We are honored to have with us the man whom the New York Times calls the most influential conservative Christian thinker in all of America. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Robert George.
Thank you very much, Father.
Let me get this out of your way.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Father, for that kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming out on this cold winter night with snow piled up to spend a little time with me, thinking about the nature and basis of religious freedom. In my work as chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, which Father kindly mentioned, I spend most of my time on practical problems, trying to bring assistance to people who are persecuted, trying to get prisoners of conscience out of jail in Pakistan or Saudi Arabia or other places where people are being oppressed. But it's good from time to time, it's certainly interesting to me as a philosopher, but I think it's good for all of us from time to sit back and do a little bit of philosophical thinking, theoretical thinking, about the nature and basis of our most fundamental and cherished rights, including what we in America call the first freedom, religious freedom. What is the basis of religious freedom? Is religious freedom simply the fruit of a deal, a modus vivendi, a mutual non-aggression pact. I'll respect your religious freedom, and in return you will respect mine. Is that it? If that's it, then there really isn't such a thing as a human right to religious freedom. It's just a deal. And what basis does anybody have for keeping the bargain if they can get away with not keeping the bargain? If they can become the oppressor and feel pretty confident that they can maintain the upper hand. So I would like to think that there's more to it than that it's not merely a modus vivendi, a mutual non-aggression pact, a deal, that there is such a thing really as a human right to religious freedom. And so I'm going to argue this evening for that proposition, that there really is a human right, a right grounded in our nature as human beings, a reflection of our dignity as human persons. Now, I want to begin, though, with a warning and an apology, and they're both related to my opening paragraph. The warning is that you probably won't have the slightest idea what I'm saying, so I'm hoping you won't walk out in disgust or bafflement. And the apology is that I'm going to have to start out with something so abstract and obscure. I should also add to my warning and apology a promise, and that is that I will make what I'm saying in the first paragraph clear as I go on. So that will be my challenge. But let me open with the first paragraph, which is a very abstract statement that is foundational for everything else that I'm going to say. But as I say, I will make it clear as I go on. So here goes the first statement. We will get through this. The starting points of all ethical reflection, not just about religious freedom or human rights, all ethical reflection, the starting points are certain fundamental and irreducible aspects of the well-being and fulfillment of human persons that some philosophers call basic human goods. These goods, as more than merely instrumental ends or purposes, that is, objectives that we want not merely as means to other ends, but as ends in themselves, having true and rich and good friendships, enriching our understanding, our knowledge, leading lives that are virtuous and not dissipated, being healthy, flourishing in respect of our biological well-being. All of these things that we want for more than merely instrumental purposes, want for their own sakes, not just what they can get us, are the subjects of the very first principles of practical reason that, as Aquinas taught, control all rational thinking with a view to acting, whether the acts performed are in the end properly judged to be morally good or morally bad. The first principles of practical reason direct our choosing towards what is rationally desirable, capable of being chosen on the basis of deliberation and judgment, because humanly fulfilling and therefore intelligibly available to choice, and away from the privations of those goods. It is, in the end, the integral directiveness of these principles of practical reason that direct action toward what is intelligibly choice-worthy because humanly fulfilling, and away from the privations of those things, that provides the criterion, or when specified, the set of criteria, that is to say, the moral norms: do unto others as you'd have them do unto yourselves, don't do evil, something in itself evil, even for the sake of good consequences, or more specific norms like thou shalt not kill, or thou shalt not steal, or thou shalt not commit adultery, or very, very specific moral norms like don't hit your sister. These are what distinguish, it's the integral directiveness, the specifications of the integral directiveness of the first principles of practical reason, directing our action toward what is choice-worthy because fulfilling, that determines what is morally good and distinguishes it from what's morally bad, including what's just from what's unjust. Morally good choices are choices that are in line with the various aspects of human well-being and fulfillment integrally understood. Morally bad choices are choices that are not. We're through it. Okay? Everyone survived. And no one walked out. Now, what did he mean by all that stuff? Well, to say the very abstract things that I've just subjected you to is to simply spell out philosophically the point made by Martin Luther King in his famous letter from the Birmingham jail, written in 1963, about just and unjust laws, that is, laws that honor people's rights and those that violate them. Perhaps some of you have recently, since we just had Martin Luther King Day, reread the letter from the Birmingham jail or saw references to it on your Twitter feeds or Facebook. You'll recall, perhaps, that the great civil rights champion anticipated a challenge from those who were his critics. A challenge to the moral goodness of the acts of civil disobedience that had landed him in jail in Birmingham. He anticipated those critics asking him, "How can you, Dr. King, engage in willful lawbreaking when you yourself had stressed the importance of obeying the law in demanding that officials of the southern states conform their conduct to the Supreme Court's desegregation ruling in the case of Brown versus Board of Education just a few years earlier?" And here's what Dr. King said, or had to say, in response to those critics. I quote him at some length. "The answer," King says, "lies in the fact that there are two types of laws, just and unjust. I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One has not only a legal but a moral obligation to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all." Now, what is the difference between the two? This is still King. How does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made law that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law. The next time when you're having an argument about a morally charged issue of public policy and somebody says, "Well, look, you shouldn't bring your religion into this, you should keep your religion out of it, you shouldn't impose your religion on other people," just quote these passages from Dr. King and ask them if they thought Dr. King should keep his religion out of politics. But he goes on, "Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority." So says Dr. King. So, just laws elevate and ennoble the human personality, or what King in other contexts refers to as the human spirit. And unjust laws debase or degrade the human spirit. Now, his point about the morality or immorality of laws is a good reminder that what is true of what is sometimes called personal morality is also true of political morality, the moral conduct or behavior of political institutions. The choices and actions of such institutions at every level, like the choices and actions of individual persons, can be right or wrong, morally good or morally bad. They can be, in other words, in line with human well-being and fulfillment in all its manifold dimensions, or they can fail in any of a range of ways to respect the integral flourishing of the human being. See, I'm coming back now to that first paragraph. In many cases of the failure of laws, policies, and institutions to fulfill the basic requirements of morality, we speak intelligibly and rightly, in my view, of a violation of human rights. This is particularly true where the failure is properly characterized as an injustice, failing to honor people's equal worth and dignity, failing to give them or even actively denying them what they are due. Now, our philosophy and theology faculty will be well aware that there are philosophers and theologians who have been highly critical of the use of rights language, especially in Christian discourse. Joan Lockwood O'Donovan famously has criticized as unchristian. Have some of you, I see some faces smiling, you familiar with Dr. O'Donovan's work? Criticized as just alien to the Christian understanding of morality, the idea of rights, because they are inherently individualistic. My very dear friend and colleague, Mary Ann Glendon, who's serving with me on the President's Council on Bioethics, the great Harvard law professor, has written a book called Rights Talk, highly critical of the exaggerated use of human rights language or appeals to human rights. Exaggerated in the sense that it obscures important parallel concepts like responsibilities, or turns claims or desires into rights. I have a right to something because I want it. I have a right to something because I feel this way or that way. Now, Glendon, rightly in my view, doesn't reject, as O'Donovan does, the very concept of rights or treat it as unchristian. But I think she is right to criticize this abuse of the language of rights, this rights inflation, as she calls it. And I think we need to be careful of that when we employ the language of rights. And yet I think there's a legitimate and important place for that language. So I don't think we should hesitate, where appropriate, to speak the language of human rights and to make appeals to human rights, if we can defend what we're saying. And it's not just, I feel this way, or I want something, therefore I've got a right to it. But contrary to the teaching of the late John Rawls and the extraordinarily influential stream of contemporary liberal thought of which Professor Rawls was the leading exponent, I want to suggest that good is prior to right, and indeed to rights. Rawls famously in his book, A Theory of Justice, and then later in his second master work, Political Liberalism, argued that a proper political theory will treat the right or rights as prior to the good. And I think it's exactly the other way around. That obscure concept I will now explain. To be sure, human rights, including the right to religious liberty, are among the moral principles that demand respect from all of us, including governments and international institutions, which are morally bound not only to respect human rights, but also to protect them. That's their job, as Jefferson says in the, I think, second sentence or third of the Declaration of Independence. It's for the protection of rights that governments are instituted among men. To respect people, to respect their dignity, is to, among other things, respect their rights, including, to be sure, the right that we're gathered this evening to consider, the right to religious freedom. Like all moral principles, however, human rights, including the right to religious liberty, as moral principles, action-guiding principles, norms, are shaped, given their content, by the human goods that they protect. Go back to that very abstract first paragraph. Rights, like other moral principles, are intelligible as rational action-guiding principles, norms, because they are, as I argued, entailments and at some level specifications of the integral directiveness or prescriptivity of those principles of practical reason that direct our choosing toward what is humanly fulfilling and enriching, or as Dr. King would say, uplifting, and away from what is contrary to our well-being, to our flourishing, as the kind of creatures we are, namely human persons. And so, for example, if I'm right about the relationship of the good and the right, that good is fundamental and prior to right and to the identification of rights, then it matters to the identification and defense of the right to life that human life is no mere instrumental good, but rather is an intrinsic aspect of the good of human persons as embodied creatures. In other words, an integral dimension of our overall flourishing. A creature can't flourish unless it's alive, and being alive and being healthy is part of the well-being, the flourishing of the human being alongside other aspects of our flourishing in the intellectual dimension of our lives, being alert, astute, critical in our judgments, thoughtful, rather than being mindless, inattentive, willing to believe the last thing you read, uncritical, and so forth. Or alongside the good of friendship. We can flourish in respect of our relationships, have lots of good, rich relationships with family and friends, true friendships, truly willing the good of the other for the sake of the other. Or we can be like Ebenezer Scrooge, who may be flourishing in health and certainly flourishing in wealth, and maybe flourishing in his intellectual life, but not flourishing in his the social aspects of his well-being. And it matters, and critically matters, to the identification and defense of the right to religious liberty that religion is yet another irreducible aspect of human well-being and fulfillment, a basic human good. Now your ears should be perking up, and you should be asking yourself, did the professor just slip the rabbit into the hat right there? By claiming that, all of a sudden, alongside friendship and knowledge and virtue and aesthetic appreciation and critical skills, that religion is a basic human good. After all, there are people like my former colleague in New College, Oxford, Richard Dawkins, who says religion's bad. It's not only not a basic good, it's not a good at all. It's a bad thing. So how does George come off claiming that there's this good of religion that is the very ground of our right to religious liberty? That's a very controversial thing to say, isn't it? Religion is a basic human good? He can't just assert that. He's got to defend it. After all, there are people like Dawkins, Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens, Harris, all the new atheists, Nietzsche, a much more serious and formidable atheist. Well, I think we can actually show that in a sense that is highly relevant to the defense of religious liberty, there is indeed a good of religion. We can understand it, we can grasp it in much the same way that we can grasp the more than merely instrumental value of having true friendships and not just using each other, having true knowledge and not just believing anything that anybody tells you, and so forth. But what is religion? And that's the question. How will I define religion? The Supreme Court has spent decades resolving cases on the basis of the free exercise or non-establishment of religion while never defining it, while saying it can't be defined. But I'm going to give it a shot. I want to say that in its fullest and most robust sense, religion is the human person's being in right relation to the divine, the more than merely human source or sources, if there be such, of meaning and value. Now, of course, even the greatest among us in the things of the Spirit fall short of perfection in various ways. Even Mother Teresa would go to confession, and she would have stuff to say. But in the ideal of perfect religion, the person would understand as comprehensively and deeply as possible the body of truths about spiritual things, and would fully order his or her life and share in the life of a community of faith, since we're social beings, that is ordered in line with those truths. In the perfect realization of the good of religion, one would achieve the relationship that the divine, say God himself, assuming just for the moment the truth of monotheism, wishes us to have with him. But of course, different traditions of faith, different religions, have different views of what constitutes religion in its fullest and most robust sense. There are different doctrines, different scriptures, different structures of authority, different ideas about what is true about spiritual things and what it means to be in proper relationship to the more than merely human sources of meaning and value that different traditions understand as divinity. Now, for my part, although it's not essential to my argument, but to get my cards more fully out on the table, just so you know, I believe that reason, the intellect, the mind, has a very large role to play for each of us, not just for fancy intellectuals and scholars, for each of us in deciding where spiritual truth most robustly is to be found. And by reason here, I mean not only our capacity for moral reasoning, or moral judgment, but also our capacities for understanding and evaluating claims of all sorts, because they've got to be evaluated if you're going to make decisions about what you believe in terms of religion. Logical claims, historical claims, scientific claims, and so forth. But as I say, that's not essential to my argument, and one need not agree with me about the high role of reason in the religious life, or the quest for religious knowledge. You can have a more mystical view, I suppose. You needn't agree with me about the role of reason to affirm with me that there is, in fact, a distinct basic human good of religion, understood as an end or purpose that provides a more than merely instrumental reason for action, an aspect of our well-being and fulfillment as human beings, a good that is uniquely architectonic. It plays a shaping role in shaping one's pursuit of and participation in all the other goods of life, and that one begins, and here's the crucial move, one begins to realize and participate in that good, to achieve it, to bring it into one's life, from the moment one begins the quest to understand the more than merely human sources of meaning and value, and to live authentically and with integrity by ordering one's life in line with one's best judgments about the truth in religious matters, including, if one so judges, living one's life with authenticity and integrity in line with one's belief that there are no more than merely human sources of meaning and justice, or meaning and value. In other words, even the atheist who sincerely asks the existential questions, pursues the religious questions, embarks upon the quest, and who sincerely judges that there is no truth, but who tries, or no God, no spiritual realities, only this material world, but who tries to live with authenticity and integrity in line with that judgment, the Camus type figure, is nevertheless realizing at least some part of the good of religion. And that's true even if that person is wrong on the God question. If I'm right, in other words, then the existential raising of religious questions, the honest identification of answers, and the fulfilling of what one sincerely believes to be one's duties in light of those answers are all parts of the human good of religion, a good whose pursuit is an indispensable feature of the comprehensive flourishing of a human being. And that proposition is one that even Brother Dawkins can agree with. After all, and here I have the advantage of actually knowing him, I had him as a friend, Dawkins would not want his own children to go through life never raising the existential questions or believing in atheism only because he told them that's what they should believe, or believing it only out of loyalty to him, or failing to live authentically and with integrity in line with their judgments, whatever they are, and not pretend to be a believer in order to get advancement or to have people think well of you if in fact you're not a believer, or pretend not to be a believer because maybe at your university or in your profession you'll be looked down on or not get ahead if you're known as one of those religious people. Dawkins would want that for his children every bit as much as I would want it for my children. So whatever you name that, that is an irreducible aspect of our well-being and fulfillment that we can grasp and get hold of in the same way we can grasp the more than merely instrumental value of actually being a friend and not just using other people, or actually knowing the truth about things and not just going through life full of wishful thinking. If this is right, if what I'm saying is right, then one of the things we can say about the human person, the human being, is that human beings are intrinsically and by nature religious beings, or beings who ask religious questions and try to answer them and try to live in line with them. Homo religiosus, to borrow a concept, or at least a couple of words of Latin from Eliade. And the flourishing of man's spiritual life is an integral aspect of his all-round well-being and fulfillment. So just as we want our kids to be physically healthy, flourish in respect of their biological, physical well-being, intellectually sharp, flourish in respect of their intellectual well-being, have good, true friendships and good relationships with their family members, flourish in respect of their social well-being, be able to make intelligent aesthetic judgments, flourish in respect of that aspect of our well-being. Parents, good parents, whether they are Christians or Jews or Buddhists or Hindus or Muslims or unbelievers like Dawkins, want their kids to flourish in respect of those existential questions and the leading of lives of integrity and authenticity with respect to the answers they embrace. But if that one is true, then respect for a person's well-being, or more simply, respect for the person, because to respect a person simply means to respect the well-being of the person, demands respect for his or her flourishing as a seeker of truth, including religious truth, and as a man or woman who lives in line with his best judgments of what is true in spiritual matters. And that, in turn, requires respect for his or her liberty in the religious quest, the quest to understand religious truth and order one's life in line with it. Because faith of any type, including religious faith, cannot be authentic. It cannot be faith unless it's free. In other words, a coerced faith, whatever else it is not faith. You can coerce, government can coerce, a parent can coerce, a bully can coerce, outward acts of conformity to what faith would require if you actually believed. But nobody, even the worst bully in the world, the most powerful king, nobody can actually reach the interior acts of intellect and will that are what faith actually is. And that's why respect for the human person, respect for his or her dignity as a free and rational creature, requires respect for his or her religious freedom, requires respect for the freedom of the person to raise those questions, to answer them as best he or she can, to try to live with integrity, authentically, in line with his or her best judgments. And that's why it makes sense from the point of view of reason, and not merely from the point of view of the revealed teachings of any particular faith, to understand religious freedom not as a mere modus vivendi, a deal, a mutual non-aggression pact, but as a fundamental human right, an aspect of the dignity of the person, following from the nature of the person as someone whose good integrally includes the asking of the questions, the honest identification of answers, the living with authenticity and integrity in line with best judgments. Now, interestingly and tragically, in times past and even in some places today, as Father pointed out in the introduction, regard for persons' spiritual well-being has been the premise and motivating factor for actually denying people religious liberty, or conceiving people's religious liberty in a narrow and cramped and restricted way. Before the Catholic Church embraced the robust conception of religious freedom that honors the civil right to give public witness and expression to sincere religious beliefs, even when erroneous, in the document Dignitatis Humanae of the Second Vatican Council, some Catholics rejected the idea of a right to religious freedom on the theory that, to use the old slogan, only the truth has rights. Why should we respect people's religious freedom if they're wrong? Error has no rights. Only the truth has rights. The idea that that slogan was expressing was that the state, the civil government, the civil power, under favoring conditions, where it's possible, where it won't make the situation worse, where there aren't prudential reasons not to do it, should not only publicly identify itself with Catholicism as the true faith, but forbid religious advocacy or proselytizing that could lead people into religious error and apostasy. Now, that was a mistake, as Dignitatis Humanae makes clear. People who did that, even popes who made that argument, were, the church now teaches us, in error to make it. But the mistake was not in the premise. That is, the idea that religion is a great human good, and the truer the religion, the better for the fulfillment of the believer. That premise is true. And anybody, including an unbeliever, ought to be able to affirm it. The mistake, rather, was in the supposition made by some that the good of religion was not being advanced or participated in at all outside the context of the one true faith, and that it could be reliably protected and advanced by placing civil restrictions enforceable by agencies of the state on the advocacy of religious ideas or on religious practices. It was in rejecting this proposition firmly that the fathers of the Second Vatican Council took their stand. And it wasn't a stand that embraced the idea that error, in fact, has rights. Rather, what the fathers of the Second Vatican Council noticed and made clear is that people have rights even when they are in error. And among those rights, integral to authentic religion as a fundamental and irreducible aspect of the human good, human well-being, human fulfillment, is the right to express and even advocate in line with one's sense of one's conscientious obligation, one's obligation in conscience, what one believes to be true about religious matters, even if one's beliefs are, in one way or another, as a matter of fact, less than fully sound, and indeed, even if they are false. Christians have to believe, it's part of what it means to be a Christian, that the proposition that Jesus Christ is not the Messiah promised to the Jewish people, is not the eternal second person of the Blessed Trinity. Catholics, Christians, have to believe that proposition is false. But Catholics don't have to believe, and in light of the teaching of the Second Vatican Council, cannot, as good Catholics, believe that that view may legitimately be suppressed, or that people may be punished for holding that view or for promoting that view, giving witness to their best judgment of the matter, even if, as Christians believe, it's false. Now, when I've assigned the document Dignitatis Humanae in courses addressing questions of religious liberty, I've always stressed to my students the importance of reading that document together with another document of the Second Vatican Council, a document called Nostra Aetate. Now, whether one is, and Nostra Aetate was the Church's, Second Vatican Council's document on the non-Christian religions. It became very, 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 very famous, justly, as a statement about the Church's relationship or attitude toward and relationship with the Jewish people, repudiating anti-Semitism, the charge of deicide. It's a very important milestone document in healing divisions between Catholics and Jews and rectifying wrongs done by people in the name of the church to Jewish people. But that led a lot, because of the publicity that that generated, it led a lot of people to think that Nostra Aetate was the Second Vatican Council's statement on Jews and Judaism. Well, it was a statement on Jews and Judaism, but it was much more than that. It was a statement about all the great non-Christian world religions. Now, whether one is Catholic or not, I think even if you're not Catholic, Dignitatis Humanae has an enormous amount of valuable material in it, just as philosophical reflection on problems of religious freedom and human dignity. But whether you're Catholic or not, I don't think it's possible to achieve a rich understanding of Dignitatis Humanae, the Declaration on Religious Liberty, and the developed teaching of the Catholic Church, in case you care what the Catholic Church teaches about it, without considering what the Council Fathers proclaim in Nostra Aetate, the Declaration on Non-Christian Religions. In Nostra Aetate, the Fathers paid tribute to quote them, all that is true and holy, unquote, implying and then explicitly saying that there is much that is good and worthy in non-Christian faiths, including Hinduism and Buddhism, and especially, of course, Judaism and Islam as ethical monotheistic religions. In so doing, the Fathers of the Council give recognition to the ways in which religion, even where it does not include the defining content of what the Fathers as Catholics believe to be religion in its fullest and most robust sense, namely the incarnation of Jesus Christ, nevertheless enriches, ennobles, and fulfills the human person in the spiritual dimension of his being. And this is to be honored and respected in the view of the Council Fathers, because the dignity of the human person requires it. Not because we're going to make a deal with the Muslims or we're going to make a deal with the Buddhists. It's not a modus vivendi. It's not a mutual non-aggression pact. It's not a I'll leave you alone if you leave me alone. It's a human right grounded in a human good, an aspect of the human good, an effort to understand and respect what is required for the dignity of the human person to be honored. Thus the title of the document, Dignitatis Humanae, human dignity. Now, naturally, the non-recognition of Christ as the Son of God must count for the Fathers of the Council, as Catholics, as a falling short in the non-Christian faiths, even the Jewish faith in which Christianity is itself rooted, and which stands, according to Catholic teaching, in an unbroken and unbreakable covenant with God, just as the proclamation of Christ as the Son of God must count as an error in Christianity from a Jewish or Muslim point of view. Just the logical law of non-contradiction requires that. Either he is or he isn't. Both those propositions, it can't be true that he is and that he isn't. But the fathers teach that this does not mean that Judaism and Islam are simply false and without merit, just as neither Judaism nor Islam teaches that Christianity is simply false and without merit. On the contrary, these traditions, according to the Council Fathers, enrich the lives of their faithful in their spiritual dimensions, thus contributing vitally to their integral fulfillment. Now, the Catholic Church does not have a monopoly on what's sometimes called the natural law reasoning, by which I'm today explicating and defending the human right to religious liberty. By natural law, I mean what Dr. Martin Luther King meant in that long passage I quoted to you when he referred to natural law. What can be known about the moral law by the application of reason. But the church does have a deep commitment to such reasoning. The church does believe that most of what needs to be known to lead morally upright lives is knowable in principle, even without the benefit of revelation. There is a law, as St. Paul teaches in the letter to the Romans, written on the heart even of the Gentiles who don't have the law of Moses, a law that's sufficient for accountability and even final judgment, the natural law. And in Dignitatis Humanae, the fathers of the Second Vatican Council present a natural law argument for religious freedom. You read through the first half of the document, and there's no specifically religious authority cited, no scripture, no tradition. It's just a straightforward philosophical natural law argument. And then in the second half of the document, they buttress it with a theological argument, appeals to religious authority, especially the authority of God's revelation in sacred scripture. So let me ask you to linger with me just a little longer over the key Catholic texts so that I can illustrate by the teachings of an actual faith how religious leaders and believers, and not just statesmen concerned to craft national or international policy in circumstances of religious pluralism, can incorporate into their understanding of the basic human right to religious liberty principles and arguments available to all men and women of sincerity and goodwill by virtue of what Professor Rawls once referred to as our common human reason, the common ground that people of all faiths can operate together on. What reason can know, even apart from the data of revelation. Now let me quote at some length from Nostra Aetate, the Declaration on the non-Christian religions, to give you an appreciation of the rational basis, the basis in reason, of the Catholic Church's affirmation of the good of religion as manifested not only in Christianity, but in the other faiths. I do this in order to show how a faith, an important world religion, the Christian faith, Catholicism in particular, can root its defense of a robust conception of religious freedom, and not merely a modus vivendi or non-aggression pact with other faiths, or much less root the idea of religious freedom in religious relativism, the idea that all faiths are the same, or equally true or equally false, or religious indifferentism, it doesn't matter what religions teach, but rather can root the belief in religious freedom in a rational affirmation of the value of religion, as I've defined it, as embodied and made available to people in and through various traditions of faith. So here's what Nostra Aetate says, and I invite you to listen to what I'm about to quote very carefully. It's really quite remarkable when you think about it, but here is a conciliar teaching, the authority of the Catholic Church being put behind these words fully. So here's what it says. Throughout history, even to the present day, there is found among different peoples a certain awareness of a hidden power, which lies behind the course of nature and the events of human life. At times there is present even a recognition of a supreme being, or still more, of a father. This awareness and recognition results in a way of life that is imbued with a deep religious sense. The religions which are found in the more advanced civilizations endeavor by way of well-defined concepts and exact language to answer these questions. Thus, in Hinduism, men explore the divine mystery and express it both in the limitless riches of myth and the accurately defined insights of philosophy. They seek release from the trials of the present life by ascetical practices, profound meditation, and recourse to God in confidence and love. Buddhism, in its various forms, testifies to the essential inadequacy of this changing world. It proposes a way of life by which men can, with confidence and trust, attain a state of perfect liberation and reach supreme illumination, either through their own efforts or by the aid of divine help. So too, other religions which are found throughout the world attempt in their own ways to calm the hearts of men by outlining a program of life covering doctrine, moral precepts, and sacred rites. And now I interrupt just to say that here comes the language I quoted to you earlier that is so central to the teaching of Nostra Aetate. Here it goes. The Catholic Church rejects nothing of what is true and holy in these religions. She has a high regard for the manner of life and conduct, the precepts and doctrines, which, although in many ways differing from her own teaching, nevertheless often reflect truths which enlighten all men. Yet she proclaims, and is duty-bound to proclaim without fail, Christ, who is the way, the truth, and the life, John 1:6. In him in whom God reconciled all things to himself, 2 Corinthians 5:18-19. Men find the fullness of their religious life. The Church therefore urges her sons to enter with prudence and charity into discussion and collaboration with members of other religions. Let Christians, while witnessing to their own faith and way of life, acknowledge, preserve, and encourage the spiritual and moral truths found among the non-Christians. The Church also has high regard for the Muslims. They worship God, who is one, living and subsistent, merciful and almighty, the creator of heaven and earth, who has also spoken to men. They strive to submit themselves without reserve to the decrees of God, just as Abraham submitted himself to God's plan, to whose faith Muslims link their own. Although not acknowledging Jesus as God, they revere him as a prophet. His virgin mother they also honor, and even at times devoutly invoke. Further, they await the day of judgment and the reward of God following the resurrection of the dead. For this reason, they highly esteem an upright life and worship God, especially by way of prayer, almsgiving, and fasting. And now the document finally turns to the question for which it receives so much attention and press coverage, the question of the relationship of the Church to the Jewish people. Sounding in the depths of mystery, which is the Church, this sacred council remembers the spiritual ties which link the people of the New Covenant to the stock of Abraham. The Church of Christ acknowledges that in God's plan of salvation, the beginning of her faith and election is to be found in the patriarchs and Moses and in the prophets. She professes that all Christ's faithful who as men of faith are sons of Abraham. They are included in the same patriarch's call, and that the salvation of the Church is mystically prefigured in the exodus of God's chosen people from the land of bondage. On this account, the Church cannot forget that she received the revelation of the Old Testament by way of that people with whom God in his inexpressible mercy established the ancient covenant. Nor can she forget that she draws nourishment from that good olive tree, and by that good olive tree now, by reference to Paul's teaching, the fathers are referring to the Jewish people. From that good olive tree onto which the wild olive branches of the Gentiles have been grafted. citing here Romans 11:17. The church believes that Christ, who is our peace, has through his cross reconciled Jews and Gentiles and made them one in himself. So there, a kind of profound meditation on what is good and true and holy and right in the great religions of the world, and even a recognition of the spiritual value of teachings that deviate even from her own in certain respects. Now, returning to my own voice, of course, from the point of view of any believer, of any faith, the further away one gets from the true faith, or the truth of faith, the full truth of faith in all its dimensions, what the Council Fathers referred to in those passages I just quoted as the fullness of religious life, the less fulfillment is available. Again, that's a logical truth, or something quite close to a logical truth. The more truth you've got, the more fulfillment is available if truth is an aspect of the fulfillment of human beings. But that does not mean that even a primitive and superstition-laden faith, much less the faiths of what the Council Fathers call those advanced civilizations, is utterly devoid of value, or that there is no right to religious liberty for people who practice such a faith. Nor does it mean that atheists have no right to religious freedom. On the contrary, it means that atheists do have a full right, equal to anyone else's, of religious freedom. The fundaments of respect for the good of religion require that civil authority respect, and in appropriate ways even nurture, conditions or circumstances in which people can engage in the sincere religious quest and live lives of authenticity, reflecting their best judgments as to the truth of spiritual matters, even if those judgments are atheistic. To compel an atheist to perform acts that are premised on theistic beliefs that he cannot in good conscience share is to deny to him the fundamental bit of the good of religion that is his, namely, living with honesty and integrity in line with his best judgments about ultimate reality. It would be scandalous to force Camus, a man of great integrity, to lead a life pretending that he was a believer or a Christian. Coercing an unbeliever to perform religious acts does him no good, right? Because it's just false. It's just the outward expression of something that he doesn't believe inwardly. So coercing him does no good, because faith really must be free, and it dishonors his dignity as a free and rational person. So the violation of religious liberty is worse than futile. Now, of course, although I've given you a very robust defense of a very broad conception of religious freedom, I have to acknowledge anybody would. It is obvious, it is self-evident that there are limits to the freedom that must be respected for the sake of the good of religion and the dignity of the human person as a being whose integral fulfillment includes the spiritual quest and the ordering of one's life in line with one's judgments as to what spiritual truth requires, the truth about spiritual things requires. And that's because gross evil, even grave injustice, can be committed by sincere religious people for the sake of religion. Unspeakable wrongs can be done, and people seeking sincerely to get right with God or the gods or their conception of ultimate reality, whatever it is, they can be done even by people who sincerely think that they're doing what God's requiring them to do. The presumption in favor of respecting religious liberty must, I think, be broad and powerful for the sake of the dignity of the human person. But it's not unlimited. It can't possibly be. Even the great end of getting right with God cannot justify a morally bad means, even for the sincere believer. I don't doubt the sincerity of the ancient Aztecs in practicing human sacrifice, or the sincerity of those in the history of various traditions of faith, including my own, who used coercion and even torture in the cause of what they believed to be religiously required. But these things are deeply wrong and need not and should not be tolerated in the name of religious freedom. To suppose otherwise is to back oneself into the awkward position of supposing that violations of religious freedom and other injustices of equal gravity must be respected for the sake of religious freedom. And obviously that can't be right, just self-contradictory. Still, to overcome the broad presumption in favor of religious liberty that's generated by the value of religion, and therefore the liberty to pursue truth and act in line with it in the lives of human beings, to overcome that, to be justified in requiring the believer to do something contrary to his or her faith, or forbidding the believer to do something that faith requires, political authority must meet a very heavy burden. To justify, one way of capturing that is the legal test that in the United States we use when it comes to religious freedom claims under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And the terms of that test are these: to justify a law that bears negatively on the belief or practice of the believer. Even a neutral law of general applicability, that is a law that's not designed to harass some minority religion or something like that, but just has as an ordinary public law generally applicable to everybody, not cooked up in order to harass the Amish or the Jehovah's Witnesses or whoever it is, but where incidentally the burdens of the law fall on the religious believer. To do that, the law must be supported by a compelling state interest, the highest test, the highest standard known in our constitutional law. That means you need a really important reason of state to impose. And secondly, the law or policy must represent the least restrictive or least intrusive means of advancing the compelling state interest. Now, we can debate as a matter of American constitutional law or as a matter of policy whether it is or should be up to the courts or to the legislatures to decide when exemptions to general neutral laws should be granted for the sake of religious freedom, or to determine when the presumption in favor of religious freedom has been overcome. That's what courts debate in cases like the Hobby Lobby decision. Remember the Hobby Lobby decision from a couple of years ago? And some decisions like the Little Sisters of the Poor case that's coming up before the court. Now that's what the debate is about. Has the presumption, has the burden been met or not? But the substantive matter of what religious freedom demands from those who exercise the levers of state power, that is what the test should be roughly, should be something on which reasonable people of goodwill across the religious and political spectrum should agree on if they understand the nature and basis of the right to religious freedom and understand it not as a modus vivendi, not as a mutual non-aggression pact, but is as indeed a fundamental human right, something rooted in the dignity of the human being, and they should be able to understand that because it really is a matter capable of being settled by our common human reason. Thank you for your kind attention.